I still remember the exact moment it began, though at the time I didn't know it for what it was. The sunlight was spilling lazily through our bedroom window, hitting the wooden floor in golden strips, and there she was, my sister, standing in the middle of it with her hair catching the light like strands of spun copper. The way she moved, the tilt of her head, the effortless confidence in the way she laughed at something trivial, it was all so natural, so inherently her, that I froze mid-step in the doorway, caught somewhere between admiration and envy. I watched her, and the world seemed to contract around her. Every shadow, every sliver of light seemed to revolve around her presence. And me. I was the periphery, the silent observer, the shadow who wanted, more than anything, to step into that light, even just for a heartbeat. It started innocuously enough. I remember the first time I borrowed one of her sweaters, oversized, soft, faintly scented with her perfume. I remember the trembling of my fingers as I lifted it from the neatly folded pile, as if taking it without asking were an act of trespass against some sacred law. I slipped it over my head in the privacy of our room, and for a moment I thought it might be a mistake. I looked into the mirror, expecting absurdity, expecting discomfort. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach lurch and my chest constrict with a mix of fear and elation. The sweater hung differently than it did on her, of course, but there was something about the drape of the fabric, the soft fold along my collarbone, the way it brushed my fingertips, that whispered of possibility. My reflection didn't look like her, not yet, but it looked like me, or perhaps, like a version of me I had never dared acknowledge before. From that moment, everything became a subtle study in imitation. I observed her constantly, from across the room, from behind a book I pretended to read, from the corners of my eyes while she thought I was absorbed in something else. How she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous. How she laughed, soft and melodic, her head tilting slightly, the faint crinkle at the corners of her eyes. The curve of her lips when she smiled at someone, even casually, could shift the mood of a room. I tried to replicate it all, first awkwardly, painfully, my own gestures stiff and unnatural, until gradually, after countless repetitions in front of mirrors and reflected windows, my movements became smoother, more fluid. I started to feel a thrill in the imitation, but also a gnawing guilt. Was it wrong to want this? To mimic her so closely, to wish so deeply that I could somehow embody the essence of her presence? And yet, a quieter voice persisted beneath the guilt, insistent, persuasive. This is who you are, too. You just didn't know how to be yet. It wasn't only the clothes, the gestures, or the soft imitation of her voice. It was every small alteration I began to experiment with quietly when I was alone. A softer inflection in my speech, just enough to make it feel like an extension of my own voice rather than a costume. A careful adjustment of posture, the tilt of my shoulders, the way I crossed my legs. The way I smiled, subtly changing the curve of my mouth so it felt more like the smile I had always admired, the one that seemed to emanate warmth and certainty effortlessly. These were experiments in identity, and I conducted them meticulously, almost scientifically, observing myself in the mirror with a critical but strangely affectionate eye. There were moments when I caught my reflection and startled, at the depth of recognition in my own eyes. Was this vanity? Or was it the first glimmer of authenticity, the realization that beneath the surface I had always longed to inhabit this form, to express myself in ways that had felt forbidden or impossible before? The tension grew unbearable one rainy afternoon. My sister had left for a weekend trip, leaving the apartment quiet except for the soft, rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the window. The space felt almost cathedral-like in its emptiness, solemn and sacred. I approached her vanity as if approaching an altar, sliding open drawers she had meticulously organized. There it was, a scarf, soft and patterned, exactly the sort of thing she would drape over her shoulders for effortless elegance. I hesitated, breathing in shallow, anxious bursts, my fingers trembling as I lifted it. When I draped it around my neck, I felt an immediate shift, subtle but undeniable. My reflection stared back at me, and for the first time I felt the precarious, exhilarating sense of seeing myself not as the shadow, the imitator, the boy who was supposed to be content with his lot, but as someone in the process of being. The reflection was not her, it would never be her, but it was undeniably me. And yet, the thrill of recognition carried with it a pang of fear so sharp it made my chest ache. What if I had crossed a line I could never come back from? What if the me I was nurturing was forever bound to remain hidden, a ghost lurking behind borrowed fabric and careful mimicry? That night, I lay awake, listening to the rain. The apartment was dark except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the outlines of furniture and shadows. I whispered my first true confession, not to anyone, not even aloud, but to the me who had been waiting silently in the corners of my consciousness for years. I want to become her, or at least something like her, and I am afraid, but I cannot stop. Fear and exhilaration churned together, a storm inside me that mirrored the one outside. I realized that this was no longer a casual curiosity, a fleeting experiment. This was the beginning of a journey, a transformation that would not only alter the way I looked, but the way I understood myself, the way I moved through the world, the way I imagined the future. In the days that followed, I became increasingly precise in my rituals of self-exploration. I timed my practices to moments when she was out, the apartment empty, the world reduced to the muted hum of street noise and the soft glow of lamplight. I traced the lines of her clothing in my mind before I even slipped them over my body. I studied her expressions in old photographs, trying to map the subtle cues that made her presence so magnetic. Sometimes I would stand for hours before the mirror, adjusting the curve of my lips, the tilt of my head, the angle of my shoulders, until I felt that almost imperceptible shift. The moment when the reflection stopped feeling like a mimicry and started to feel like an extension of my own identity. Yet with every small triumph came an equally potent fear. What if someone discovered this secret? What if my parents, my friends, or worse, she herself, knew what I was doing? What if they rejected me, or worse, laughed at me, reducing this intensely personal, sacred journey to a punchline? I had to conceal it. Every scarf, every borrowed sweater, every careful adjustment had to vanish, neatly folded and returned to its rightful place before anyone could glimpse it. But even as I meticulously restored the apartment to its outward normalcy, the thrill, the knowledge of what I had discovered about myself, lingered like an indelible stain. I could not unsee it. I could not unfeel it. And in those quiet moments, alone in the soft glow of streetlights or the dim morning sun, I allowed myself to dream. Dream of a self unshackled from expectation. A self who could move freely between shadows and light, between imitation and authenticity, between fear and exhilaration. And slowly, imperceptibly, the line between imitation and self-discovery began to blur. Each borrowed item, each careful gesture, each whispered experiment in solitude became a brick in the foundation of something new, fragile, and terrifyingly beautiful. I began to see that this was not just about clothing, or hair, or the tilt of a smile. It was about truth, about stepping into a form that felt like the skin I had always meant to inhabit. About accepting, finally, that the me who had been hiding in shadow for so long deserved to exist, deserved to take up space, deserved to see herself reflected in the light, even if no one else ever did. And so, that first weekend, with the apartment silent and empty, I allowed myself to linger before the mirror longer than ever before, draping scarves, adjusting hair, practicing speech and posture. The reflection stared back with a mix of uncertainty and burgeoning certainty, a flicker of recognition that made my chest tighten with emotion. I whispered again, softer this time, almost reverently, I am here. I exist. And I am beginning to see myself. The next weeks felt like walking on a knife's edge. Each day was an intricate balance between who I was expected to be and who I longed, aching, desperately to become. At school, I moved through corridors as if suspended in water. Everyone's voices sounded muted, footsteps like muffled drum beats, and I was constantly aware of the space between my shadow self and the self I craved. Every glance from a classmate, every remark tossed casually, became a test, a measure of my control. Could I smile, gesture, talk, without betraying the whirlpool inside me? Could I exist in the world without anyone knowing I was quietly crafting a new identity in stolen fragments of fabric, borrowed gestures, whispered rehearsals? At home, the tension transformed into ritual. My bedroom became a sanctuary, a place where I could explore the subtleties of femininity that had haunted me for so long. I would close the door and sit for hours in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, adjusting collars, draping scarves, learning the invisible lines of her silhouette and trying to feel them as if they were mine. Some nights I would lie in bed afterward, exhausted and trembling, heart pounding, whispering to myself in the darkness, "Is this wrong? Am I a fraud?" And then, almost imperceptibly, a quieter voice would push back, patient and persistent. "No, this is you. You've been hiding, but now you're beginning to see yourself. Keep going." There were days when I tried to blend, to be careful, to keep the mask of normalcy perfectly in place. But the more I immersed myself in the private world I had constructed, the more fragile the facade became. I would catch glimpses of myself in reflective surfaces, shop windows, shiny tabletops, even the tiny puddles from rain, and the reflection would flicker, as if it were uncertain which version of me should exist. And sometimes, just for a heartbeat, I allowed myself to linger there, tracing the curves of my borrowed clothing, feeling the tilt of my head, listening to the soft timbre of a voice I was learning to shape. And in that moment, it was almost unbearably real. The hardest moments, though, were the ones where imitation collided with longing. I would watch her, my sister, move through life with effortless grace, her laughter echoing in ways that drew others toward her warmth, and I would ache, a hollow longing that pressed against every bone in my body. I wanted that grace, not just the appearance of it. I wanted her confidence, her fluidity, the subtle magnetism that made people turn their heads when she entered a room. And yet, as I tried to inhabit these small fragments of her identity, I realized that I could not simply become her. I could only become me, a version of me that was learning to exist fully, without apology, without hiding, in the strange, trembling space between imitation and self-realization. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, and imagine scenarios in vivid detail. How would it feel to step outside dressed the way I longed to move through the world without hiding behind layers of pretense? To hear someone compliment me, not for who I had always been expected to be, but for who I was finally allowing myself to be. The thought thrilled and terrified me simultaneously. I imagined people looking at me, really seeing me, and my chest would tighten with both hope and dread. What if they rejected me? What if they laughed? What if, after all this careful work, the me I was building still wasn't enough to belong in the world I wanted to inhabit? My sister remained, unwittingly, both guide and tormentor. Every nuance of her behavior was a lesson and a challenge. I would watch how she moved through social spaces, how she interacted with friends, how her gestures, slight and precise, commanded attention without demanding it. I copied her, of course, in secret, recreating smiles, tilting my head in the same way, experimenting with inflections in my voice, but always aware of the impossibility of being her. That impossibility, however, carried with it a paradoxical freedom. If I could never be her, I had to find a version of myself that could exist independently, that could inhabit these borrowed gestures and transformed movements while still feeling authentic. And in that crucible of contradiction, something began to take shape, a fragile, shimmering identity that belonged solely to me. One afternoon, the experiment became dangerous. My sister had left a blouse unfolded on her chair, a delicate silk piece in soft pastels, almost whispering my name from across the room. I approached it like a pilgrim approaching a relic, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat. Sliding it over my shoulders, I froze. The fabric shimmered, brushing my skin with a sensation that was almost electric. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. The mirror reflected a version of me that was unfamiliar yet undeniable, and my chest constricted with emotion I couldn't name. It was exhilaration, terror, longing, and recognition all at once. I traced the fabric down my arms, the weight of it settling like a secret I could barely contain. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't just about clothing. It was about claiming a space in the world where I could exist fully, without apology, without fear, without pretending to be someone I was not. The following days became a delicate dance of concealment and exploration. Every borrowed scarf, every carefully draped sweater, every subtle experiment in posture or speech had to vanish before she returned. And yet, the knowledge of what I had discovered lingered in my veins, a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. I began to document it in my mind, creating a map of self that was both tentative and urgent, charting gestures, movements, sounds, and expressions, until I could inhabit them almost instinctively. The reflection in the mirror stopped being a mimicry and started to feel like a revelation. Each day, each experiment, was a brick in the fragile, trembling foundation of a self that was finally beginning to breathe. Evenings became the most intense periods of self-study. I would stand before the mirror for hours, adjusting the curve of my lips, the tilt of my head, the angle of my shoulders. Sometimes I would close my eyes, imagining stepping outside, moving through the world dressed in the way I had been dreaming, feeling eyes turn toward me in curiosity or admiration, and my heart would hammer against my ribs. And then, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel something I had never allowed myself to feel before: hope. The kind of hope that trembles, that is fragile, that can vanish in an instant, but that is real, undeniable, and alive. I am here, I exist, and I am beginning to see myself. Weeks stretched on like this, a blend of terror and ecstasy, imitation and discovery, fear and longing. And through it all, a central truth began to crystallize: I could not stop. I could not abandon this journey, this exploration, this slow, painstaking construction of a self I had long denied. Every borrowed gesture, every whispered experiment, every silent rehearsal was a declaration, a defiance, and a promise, to myself, first and foremost, that I would not remain invisible any longer. And in that quiet, almost sacred obsession with becoming, I began to realize that my reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was a witness. It was a companion. It was the first flicker of recognition from the self I had been too afraid to embrace. And in that flicker, fragile and trembling as it was, I felt something I had never felt before: possibility. The first time I left my apartment wearing even the smallest piece of what I had been building, I felt the world shift around me. It was a Saturday morning, quiet, almost eerily so, and I had chosen a simple outfit, something that felt safe, familiar enough to draw no suspicion, yet carried within it the weight of everything I had been rehearsing in private. A soft pastel scarf, a sweater slightly too long, my hair brushed in the careful way I had spent hours perfecting. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflective surface of the elevator doors, and for the briefest instant, I did not recognize the person staring back. My chest tightened, not from fear alone, but from a raw, almost unbearable awareness of my own audacity. Here I was, moving through the world in fragments of the self I had longed to be, and no one yet knew. The streets were empty enough to offer a false sense of security. Every step I took felt exaggerated, amplified by the beating of my own heart in my ears. I was acutely aware of the way my scarf shifted over my shoulders, the subtle sway of my sweater as I moved, the way my head tilted differently now, an unconscious echo of the posture I had memorized from my sister. I passed a small shop window, and I couldn't resist the pull. I turned, and there it was, a reflection that startled me with its immediacy. The face was mine, but changed, softened, unfamiliar, yet undeniably me. I tilted my head slightly, trying different angles, testing the response of the reflection as if it were an audience. My pulse raced, the air in my lungs felt sharp, and for a moment I wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously, overwhelmed by the reality that I had ventured out, that I had dared to exist in this space. Walking further, the city began to awaken. People started to appear, and with them, a new kind of tension, the awareness that someone could see me, recognize the quiet experimentation I had been practicing for weeks in private. Each glance from passers-by felt like a probe, a test. I tried to maintain a casual posture, a measured stride, but inside I was taut, every nerve on alert. And then it happened, a brief, accidental eye contact with a stranger, a woman carrying groceries, who smiled politely. That smile, simple and fleeting, sent a shiver down my spine. For a split second, I imagined that she saw me, really saw me, not the shadow I had been, not the boy who had spent years hiding, but the me I was beginning to build. The thought was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly exhilarating. I made my way to a small cafe I had been eyeing for weeks, one that always seemed welcoming, with large windows and warm light spilling onto the street. I ordered a drink, my voice trembling slightly as I spoke the words aloud, practicing the softer inflections I had rehearsed countless times in solitude. The barista smiled, polite and professional, and in that brief interaction, I felt a rush of validation and anxiety intertwined. My reflection caught in the polished surface of the counter, and I studied it obsessively. The subtle curve of my lips, the tilt of my eyes, the gentle fall of my hair over my shoulders. It was still tentative, fragile, incomplete, but undeniably present. I was no longer merely imagining this self. I was walking through the world as her, and it was exhilarating beyond measure. But with exhilaration came a sharp undercurrent of fear. Every movement I made, every gesture, every tone of voice felt exposed, a test I could not fail. What if someone I knew saw me? What if a friend from school, a parent, a stranger familiar enough to recognize my shadow self, glimpsed me and dismissed this painstakingly constructed identity as a joke, a phase, a failure? I gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening, and forced myself to breathe slowly, to center myself in the moment. I reminded myself that no one knew yet, that the city was vast, that I had chosen a path of secrecy for a reason. And still, the fear lingered, subtle and insistent, like a shadow at the edge of a bright room. Sitting in the cafe, I began to notice other people in a new way. Women and men alike moved with ease and confidence, their gestures fluent, their expressions natural. I studied them obsessively, learning, absorbing, storing the nuances for later rehearsal. The way one woman tucked her hair behind her ear mid-conversation, the tilt of a man's head as he laughed softly, the fluidity of posture in a group of friends talking animatedly. All of it became data, a manual for constructing the self I was still learning to inhabit. I felt both exhilarated and painfully aware of my own clumsiness, the lingering traces of the boy I had been before this journey began. And yet, even in that discomfort, I felt a spark of hope, the knowledge that this was possible, that transformation was not only a dream but something I could enact, step by deliberate step. The cafe visit ended, and I ventured further into the city, testing myself against the public eye. Each interaction, each accidental glance, became a rehearsal in real time. I found myself hyper-aware of clothing, of movement, of the subtle messages conveyed by posture and voice. Every reflection became a study, every mirror in a shop window an experiment. And yet, with each passing hour, the tension began to morph into something else, an intoxicating mixture of possibility and dread. I was learning to exist publicly, tentatively, fearfully, but undeniably, as the self I had longed to be. Returning home, I felt a surge of relief mixed with triumph. The apartment door closed behind me, sealing away the potential scrutiny of the outside world. I allowed myself to collapse onto my bed, trembling, exhausted, yet profoundly exhilarated. I had stepped into the world and I had survived. More than survived, I had been seen, even if only in fleeting glances, and it had been enough to validate months of secret work. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, the familiar whisper of doubt returned. This is only the beginning. The world is vast, and people will notice. Can you truly inhabit this self fully, without compromise? Over the following weeks, I began to push the boundaries gradually. I experimented with hairstyles, with accessories, with subtler shifts in posture and movement. Each venture outside my apartment became a calculated risk, a rehearsal in courage. Sometimes I stumbled, voice faltering in a conversation, hands trembling as I adjusted a scarf, but each misstep was a lesson, a brick in the foundation of a self I was still learning to trust. My private rituals grew more detailed. I recorded my movements, studied the reflection of light on fabric, memorized gestures, practiced the soft inflections of voice until they felt natural. And every night, alone in my room, I repeated the mantra that had begun to anchor me. I exist. I am here. I am real. Yet despite progress, doubt persisted, a shadow that clung stubbornly. I wondered whether anyone could ever understand, whether the me I was constructing could exist safely in the world without ridicule or rejection. I feared exposure, but I also feared stagnation, feared returning to the shadowed self I had left behind. And so I pressed forward, navigating the fragile terrain between fear and courage, imitation and authenticity, secrecy and revelation. Each small victory, each survival of a public moment, strengthened me, but also intensified the emotional stakes, the sense that this journey was no longer optional. By the end of that month, I realized something profound. I was no longer merely practicing, no longer merely imitating. The reflection in the mirror, the body I inhabited, the gestures and inflections I had painstakingly cultivated. They were becoming a self in their own right, a presence that existed independently of the shadow I had been. And in that presence, fragile and trembling as it was, I glimpsed the possibility of a life lived fully, unapologetically, in the shape I had longed to inhabit. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt the exhilarating certainty that it could succeed, that I could survive, and that I could, slowly but deliberately, claim a space in the world for the self I was finally learning to see. The first time I allowed myself to be seen intentionally, even in a controlled way, the world felt unbearably sharp and vivid, like walking through sunlight with raw skin. I had practiced countless times in my apartment, rehearsing gestures, inflections, the subtle sway of my shoulders, the tilt of my head, every nuance I thought could carry me across the fragile bridge between private desire and public perception. But stepping outside, deliberately, into a space where anyone, could notice was unlike anything I had imagined. My chest felt hollow, yet impossibly tight at once, like a storm trapped beneath my ribs. My reflection in the glass doors of a nearby shop froze me momentarily. It was me, unmistakably, yet also a stranger I was only beginning to understand. I had chosen a cafe in the quieter part of the city, one I had observed for weeks. Its wooden tables and warm light offered a veneer of intimacy and safety. I crossed the threshold and immediately felt the weight of every eye, every passing glance, every human awareness as if it were a tangible thing pressing against my skin. I wanted to shrink, to dissolve, but I forced myself to stand tall, to breathe deliberately, to inhabit the body and voice I had been cultivating in the quiet of my bedroom. The barista greeted me casually, and I realized that to them, I was simply another person ordering a coffee. And yet, in that ordinariness lay something profoundly liberating, the first inkling that I could exist in the world as myself, and it could feel safe. I took a corner table, a vantage point from which I could observe without being entirely observed, though I knew that might be a fragile illusion. Every movement became a careful study. The way I sipped my drink, the gentle crossing of my legs, the tilt of my head as I pretended to read a book. People passed by, their footsteps like tiny tremors, and I imagined every fleeting glance as a potential revelation, a chance to be seen, truly seen, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. I was terrified someone would notice a flaw, a twitch, a lingering sign of the self I had left behind, and yet, simultaneously, I was intoxicated by the possibility that someone might glimpse the real me, the me I was daring to create. When I returned home that evening, the apartment felt both suffocating and sanctuary-like. I slipped into the mirror's reflection, letting the borrowed scarf fall over my shoulders, adjusting it obsessively, memorizing every curve, every fold, every shadow. I traced the outline of my jaw with my fingertips, imagining the light catching my face as if it were someone else's, a stranger I longed to know. The reflection stared back, and I realized with a jolt that it had begun to carry a life of its own. It was no longer mimicry. It was a version of me learning to exist outside secrecy, outside fear, outside imitation. And the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. The next step was riskier. School had resumed, and I found myself confronting an entirely new terrain, familiar faces in familiar spaces, but this time through the lens of my newly crafted identity. I walked the corridors with careful deliberation, each step measured, each gesture practiced. I could feel eyes tracing me, measuring, evaluating, though perhaps I imagined some of it. Each classroom, each hallway, each glance became a crucible in which I tested the resilience of this identity I was still learning to inhabit. Some moments were successes. A smile exchanged with a friend, casual yet deliberate, a brief acknowledgement that felt like validation. Others were crushing failures. A cough, a slip of posture, a tremor in my voice that reminded me painfully of the self I had been trained to hide. Home remained a sanctuary, but even there the emotional stakes escalated. I found myself hiding longer, lingering before the mirror in longer, more meticulous sessions. My sister had begun to notice small changes, nothing overt, nothing accusatory, but subtle hints that made my heart race. A glance too long in my direction, a question about why my sweater looked different than usual, a soft observation that carried unspoken curiosity. And I realized then that my secret was a living thing, fragile and dangerous, capable of discovery at any moment. It was thrilling, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. I began to experiment with more deliberate gestures, more noticeable elements of my evolving self. A ribbon in my hair, subtle adjustments to my posture, a deliberate softening of my voice in conversations. The mirror became my constant companion, and every reflection became a lesson. I learned the subtle differences between observation and performance, between imitation and authentic expression. I studied people in cafes, in streets, in parks, absorbing the nuances of their gestures and expressions, storing them for private rehearsal. Each discovery was a tiny triumph, a secret carved out of the world, a step closer to fully inhabiting the self I had longed to be. Yet the world outside remained an arena of tension. The first time I encountered someone I knew while in this self, my body froze. The encounter was fleeting, a casual nod from a classmate in the street, but it sent tremors of panic through me. My mind raced. Had they seen? Would they recognize me? Would they dismiss me, mock me, or worse, reduce the painstaking work of months to a joke? And yet, despite the fear, the encounter left me exhilarated. For the first time, I realized that people could see me, and that seeing could coexist with acceptance, or at least tolerance. The fragile hope that had begun to grow within me took root more firmly. My sister remained a paradoxical anchor and tormentor. Her presence in the apartment was a constant reminder of the life I had once unved and now longed to inhabit. Every glance, every casual gesture, every laugh carried lessons I studied obsessively. I copied her mannerisms, her subtle expressions, her effortless grace, and yet I was painfully aware of the impossibility of being her. This impossibility, however, was also liberating. If I could never be her, I had to find a version of myself that existed independently, that could inhabit borrowed gestures without losing authenticity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel a sense of self that was distinct, fragile, and uniquely mine. The psychological tension grew heavier with time. I began to feel a constant, low hum of anxiety mixed with exhilaration, a duality that permeated every waking hour. Every social interaction became a test, every reflection a study, every private rehearsal a ritual. I could not allow myself to stop, not anymore. The self I had been constructing demanded recognition, demanded space, demanded life. And in that demand, I felt both liberation and terror. The world outside the apartment was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and yet, it was precisely in that unpredictability that I began to understand the power of existence. That being seen, being recognized, being allowed to inhabit a space fully, even partially, was a revolutionary act. At night, alone in the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains, I practiced relentlessly. Every gesture, every inflection, every tilt of the head, every sway of the body became ritualistic, sacred even. I recorded myself in secret, watched the footage obsessively, made minute adjustments, experimented with new expressions and postures. The mirror became a teacher, the apartment a laboratory, and my own body the subject of constant inquiry. I was becoming fluent in the language of femininity, in the syntax of self, and with each day, the translation from private rehearsal to public presence became more seamless. And yet, despite progress, doubt remained. I feared exposure, judgment, rejection. I feared the fragility of the identity I was cultivating, the possibility that all my painstaking work could unravel in a single glance, a single word. But even in the heart of fear, a persistent flame of hope endured. I whispered to myself in the darkness, I exist, I am real, I am here. These words became both armor and affirmation, a mantra that carried me through each step, each rehearsal, each tentative venture into public space. By the end of that month, I had begun to feel the first, faint outlines of confidence. The reflection in the mirror no longer felt alien or borrowed. The body I inhabited, the gestures I performed, the voice I practiced, were becoming extensions of myself, rather than imitations of another. And in that nascent confidence, fragile and trembling as it was, I glimpsed the future. A life where I could exist publicly, fearfully but courageously, fully inhabiting the identity I had longed for. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt the exhilarating certainty that it could succeed, that I could survive, and that the self I had been cultivating could claim its rightful place in the world. Courage felt heavier than I expected, like carrying a fragile object that could shatter with the slightest misstep. That morning, the streets were alive with the usual chaos, footsteps clattering, voices overlapping, cars humming past, but each sound felt amplified in my chest. Every glance from passers-by was a pulse against my skin, a test I wasn't sure I could pass. Layers of clothing, carefully chosen gestures, and the soft inflection of my voice became my armor, yet I could feel the tension coiling tighter with every step. Fear and anticipation tangled together, so raw I could almost taste it, metallic and sweet at the back of my throat. A sharp gust of wind tugged at my scarf, and I adjusted it reflexively, feeling both exposed and alive. Across the street, a group of students laughed, their voices carrying in bursts that made my pulse spike. I told myself to breathe, to center in the mantra that had guided me through months of private rehearsals. I exist. I am real. I am here. Each word became a small anchor, a steadying force amid the chaos of the city and the storm inside me. The encounter that followed left an imprint I couldn't shake. A classmate I had known since middle school, kind, observant, and familiar, approached on the sidewalk, her gaze meeting mine with an effortless warmth. I froze, the familiar swirl of panic gripping my chest. Questions flooded my mind. Do I look authentic? Will she see the old me lurking beneath? Will she understand or reject what she sees? And then she smiled, a gentle, affirming smile that cut through the tight coil of anxiety. "Hey," she said, her tone casual but welcoming, and for the first time I felt a fragile bridge forming between who I had been and who I was becoming. I returned the smile, cautious but hopeful, and realized that acknowledgement, no matter how small, could carry the weight of months of secret struggle. At home, tension and curiosity collided in quiet, subtle ways. My sister noticed differences I had tried to disguise, how a scarf fell differently, a sweater hung just so, the way I carried myself in small, almost imperceptible shifts. Her eyes lingered, questioning, assessing, curious yet hesitant. Every observation felt like a probe into the careful world I had been constructing, and the exposure made my heart race. Yet within that same gaze, I glimpsed complexity, concern, intrigue, perhaps a measure of admiration or understanding. The unspoken tension between us thickened the air, making even ordinary interactions feel like tightrope walks. At night, I retreated into ritual. Hours passed as I moved deliberately in front of the mirror, tracing the curve of my lips, the tilt of my head, the sway of my shoulders. Shadows fell across my reflection, shifting with the lamplight, offering subtle lessons in nuance and movement. I whispered softly, affirming the existence of this self I had long hidden. I am here. I am allowed. I am becoming. Each repetition grounded me, reminding me that the person in the mirror was no longer a borrowed fragment or imitation, but a presence slowly asserting itself in the real world. The tension of public life persisted. Ordering coffee, passing neighbors, even casual conversations became exercises in courage. Every glance felt like evaluation, every gesture potentially revealing. Some encounters carried warmth, a nod, a smile, a fleeting recognition, and each one became a validation of the self I was daring to inhabit. Others left me unsettled, a puzzled look, a whispered comment, a small misstep in posture or tone. But even missteps were lessons, each one shaping the careful calibration of identity, refining gestures, voice, and presence, until I could inhabit them with increasing ease. My sister's presence remained a paradox, a tether to both fear and understanding. Moments of tension, silent observations, raised eyebrows, subtle inquiries, reminded me that the self I was building could be scrutinized, tested. Yet there were also moments of connection, shared laughter, small acknowledgments, fleeting camaraderie that felt like quiet acceptance. I learned to read her expressions, to sense her reactions, to navigate the delicate balance of concealment and authenticity. Slowly, I realized that she was part of the journey, not an obstacle, nor merely a mirror, but a companion, albeit an unspoken one, whose presence shaped the unfolding of my self-discovery. Public experimentation became deliberate. I ventured into spaces I had once avoided, each step a calculated act of courage. Cafes, streets, shops, each venue became a stage, each encounter a lesson in observation and adaptation. I studied movements, expressions, gestures, absorbing nuances for later rehearsal. Every success, every fleeting acknowledgement from a stranger, reinforced the fragile sense of coherence I was beginning to feel. I was learning to translate months of private practice into lived experience, to inhabit a public space with authenticity, and to test the limits of my courage and self-assurance. The reflection in the mirror became a companion, a witness, a repository for both triumphs and failures. I spoke aloud in solitude, affirming the presence of this emerging self. I exist. I am here. I am allowed to occupy this space. Each repetition anchored me, reinforcing the growing confidence that survival, recognition, and even joy were possible. With every layer of clothing, every gesture, every carefully practiced inflection, I felt a fragile integration forming between the private rehearsals and the public self. By the end of this period, I understood something fundamental. The journey was nonlinear, filled with doubt, fear, exhilaration, and quiet triumphs. Each encounter, every private ritual, every subtle calibration contributed to the emergence of a self that could endure scrutiny, inhabit space, and step into life with authenticity. Reflection and reality were merging. Imitation had given way to recognition. Practice had given way to embodiment, and the self I had long nurtured in secret was beginning to claim a place in the world. In those late-night hours, bathed in the soft glow of streetlight filtering through curtains, I realized that my existence was no longer contingent on secrecy. I could navigate the world, however cautiously, as the person I had longed to be. Fear remained an ever-present companion, but hope had taken root alongside it, vibrant and unshakable. My sister's quiet, paradoxical presence, sometimes a challenge, sometimes a mirror, sometimes a subtle ally, anchored me in ways I had not anticipated. And as I whispered to myself, affirming my presence in both word and reflection, I felt the faint stirrings of self-acceptance, fragile but undeniable. A recognition that this journey, however difficult and uncertain, was finally mine to inhabit fully. Evening fell like a soft, deliberate hush over the apartment, and for the first time in weeks, the city outside felt distant, almost secondary to the world I was constructing within these walls. I lingered by the window, watching the amber glow of streetlights ripple across puddles left by an afternoon rain. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, a stranger yet familiar, a composite of months of private discovery and careful experimentation. There was no imitation in the curve of my lips or the tilt of my head anymore, only presence. Presence, in its raw, fragile, undeniable form. The realization hit me like a breathless revelation. I had crossed a threshold, moving from shadowed mimicry into selfhood. I reached for the scarf draped over my shoulders, fingers tracing the soft fabric, and a smile tugged at the corner of my lips. It wasn't a practiced gesture this time. It was instinctive, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that had carried me here. The mirror no longer reflected only technique, only rehearsal. It reflected life. Each gesture, each inflection, each subtle sway of my body had been layered into something new, a living self that existed fully and unmistakably. I drew in a slow breath, allowing the tension of months to fall away, and felt the first tremor of relief. A deep, settled certainty that I could exist, that I had earned the right to occupy this space, this body, this identity. The apartment door clicked softly behind me, and my sister appeared, her expression caught between curiosity, surprise, and an emotion I couldn't immediately name. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence was thick, charged, and somehow intimate. I felt a flicker of fear. Had I overstepped? Would she judge me now, knowing the depth of my transformation, the countless private hours of rehearsal, the painstaking construction of a self I had hidden for so long? But her gaze softened, and she stepped closer, tilting her head as if measuring the weight of what I had become. "You've really changed," she said finally, voice quiet but steady, free of mockery. It wasn't just an observation. It carried nuance, recognition, and a subtle warmth that made my chest tighten. I nodded, uncertain of words. They felt inadequate. How could language capture months of hidden desire, fear, rehearsal, and revelation? How could a single sentence encompass the labyrinth of self I had been building in secret? I simply let my eyes meet hers, And in that meeting, a bridge formed, tentative but real. We spoke then not immediately, not with perfect clarity, but in fragments, pauses heavy with meaning. She asked questions, gently, carefully, not probing for judgment but for understanding. I answered in the quiet, deliberate tones I had practiced in solitude, letting the inflections carry truth rather than artifice. Every word felt weighted, every gesture measured yet natural. And in those fragmented conversations, something extraordinary occurred. Connection. Not the casual, superficial connection of everyday interaction, but a profound acknowledgement that we could exist alongside each other without pretense, without concealment, and that perhaps even love could accommodate transformation. Night deepened outside, and I realized I was trembling, not with fear, but with emotion. The journey had been long, fraught with hesitation, panic, and relentless self-questioning, but here, in the shared quiet of the apartment, I felt a kind of completion. Not total, not absolute. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, public trials, but completion of a crucial step, recognition. I existed. I was acknowledged, first by myself, and now by someone who mattered deeply. The following days became exercises in lived authenticity. I ventured into public spaces with a newfound confidence, carrying myself with the gestures, postures, and inflections I had honed in private. Yet the difference now was subtle but immense. I no longer moved cautiously, testing reactions at every step. I moved deliberately, with awareness tempered by acceptance. People noticed, sometimes briefly, sometimes with curiosity, but I found that their reactions could no longer dictate my existence. I had learned to anchor my sense of self internally, rooted in reflection, rehearsal, and the hard-earned recognition of my own presence. At school, the corridors no longer felt like obstacles. I observed, I practiced, I navigated, but the anxiety that had once tightened like a vice in my chest had loosened. A classmate smiled at me, a simple gesture, but charged with a significance I would have once agonized over. I returned the smile freely, instinctively, and felt the thrill of authentic acknowledgement ripple through me. Each interaction became less about performance and more about presence, about inhabiting my space unapologetically, even in a world I had once feared would reject me outright. Home remained a sanctuary, but it too had evolved. My sister and I developed a rhythm of coexistence that was at once tentative and comforting. There were no declarations, no grand confrontations, only quiet moments of understanding. A shared cup of tea, a soft laugh over an inside joke, a subtle acknowledgement of presence in the same room. These moments carried immense weight, proof that transformation need not sever relationships, that selfhood could coexist with connection, and that acceptance, slow, deliberate, human, was possible. Late one night, I stood before the mirror again, letting the light from the street lamps filter through the curtains. My reflection no longer startled me. I traced the lines of my jaw, the tilt of my head, the fall of my hair, and allowed myself to smile fully, unpracticed, unguarded. I am here. I am real. I am allowed. The words, once a fragile mantra, now carried resonance. I had built this self through months of painstaking effort, and in this quiet affirmation, I felt the culmination of every small triumph, every moment of fear endured, every lesson learned in shadowed solitude. The journey had been nonlinear, chaotic, and sometimes excruciating, yet it had forged something essential, a self capable of inhabiting both private reflection and public space with authenticity. I understood with clarity and awe that the transformation was not merely external. It had reshaped how I perceived myself, how I related to the world, and how I allowed love, connection, and vulnerability into my life. I had learned to trust in my own presence, to claim space, and to recognize that identity was not a static costume to wear but a living, evolving expression of being. As the night deepened, my sister entered the room silently, sitting beside me without words. The closeness was comforting, unforced, and filled with meaning. We did not need conversation. Presence alone was acknowledgement. And in that shared silence, I realized something profound. The journey had not been about imitation or perfection or concealment. It had been about emergence, about claiming the self that had always existed in fragments and bringing it fully, unapologetically into the world. And so, as the city slept and the apartment held our quiet vigil, I allowed myself to exist completely, without hesitation, without fear, without apology. The reflection in the window, the subtle warmth of my sister's presence beside me, the hum of life outside, all were witnesses to a truth long denied. I was here, I was real, and I had finally begun to inhabit the life I had always imagined, fully and beautifully as myself.